When you think of franchises going through a rough patch in its history, you will typically think of Star Wars after it was bought by Disney in 2012, or you will think of the MCU hitting its worst creative patch after the franchise's height of popularity after 2019's Avengers Endgame. And while issues such as studio interference are common within these two franchises, there is one infamous example of a franchise collapse that is almost never talked about, since the franchise picked up the pieces with later releases. This franchise in question was Batman, due in part to the numerous amounts of studio interference, bad directing decisions, and conflicts on set. Now, in 1992, Batman Returns was released to glowing praise from audiences and critics. Although the film was considered worse than its predecessor Batman 1989, fans were excited about the potential future of Batman films. From a creative standpoint and a marketing standpoint, it made perfect sense to continue the franchise as Tim Burton and Michael Keaton signed on for future projects. To keep the growing hype around for a potential sequel for Batman Returns, DC executives greenlit an animated series to air on Fox Kids titled Batman the Animated Series. The animated series was set to release in September 1992. When Batman the Animated Series was released, it was considered one of the best DC properties ever released, and is generally seen to be one of the best superhero shows of all time. DC noticed the hype that Batman the Animated Series was getting, and greenlit the first Batman film to be released since Batman Returns, titled Batman Mask of the Phantasm, which was to be released in 1993 to capitalize on the hype the Batman franchise had. Issues began when the film was rushed into theaters in December 1993, despite only having a year to develop everything. Even though the film is widely considered to be one of the best Batman films ever made, and the fact that it was a Herculean effort to make the film as good as it was, the film was a box office bomb. This was likely due in part due to the fact that the film was released due to a period where they felt like they could rush it into theaters, otherwise known as, in film terminology, a dump month. Executives hoped that enough people would see it, but that was not the case. However, despite the failure, the film would actually do pretty well when it was released to DVD in 1994, which brought up the question, if the film wasn't rushed into production, would it be even better than what we had, which is already really good? It's a lingering question that many fans still question to this day. And when it came to the movie front, it would actually not be the only example of corporate meddling. Roughly around the same time Batman Mask of the Phantasm was in production, Tim Burton, who had directed the first two Batman films, was writing a new script for the third Batman film. He wanted the third Batman film to be dark and gritty, much like the first two, as he felt that this tone was what made Batman so unique and what worked in the first two films. You see, Burton had ideas for his third film, such as the return of Michelle Pfeiffer's Catwoman, and having Two-Face return as the main villain with Billy D. Williams reprising his role from the first film. Issues began for Burton when Warner Brothers executives told him to make the films more childlike and fun as opposed to more darker and gritty. This was actually in large part due to complaints from parents about how dark and violent Batman Returns was, despite its PG-13 rating. One example being how much gratuitous violence there was in the film, such as when Batman ties a bomb to a villain, which leads to his death. Yeah, the 90s were a very interesting time for superhero fiction. Let's get that out of the way. Throughout 1992, there were actually numerous appearances by parents on network TV of them telling the media about how their children were traumatized by the film and demanded repercussions from Warner Brothers. Now, generally speaking, this might have popped in your mind when you were thinking, which was, why on earth did any executive just throw this case out of the window and just pass everyone off as pedantic busybodies? Well, the reason why the Warner Brothers didn't write off these complaints was because Batman Returns made $150 million less than Batman 1989, and thought the dark themes had a lot to do with it. Burton was adamant that the films remain a more darker adult-themed property, but Warner refused to budge. These debates went on for months and months and months, until Burton dropped out of the project, citing creative differences. Warner Brothers began their search for a new director, because they just let Tim Burton walk. And they actually had a few options to choose from, if you can believe it. A few options being John McTiernan, who was approached by Warner Brothers executives, who directed 1980s films like Predator and Die Hard. The issue was that McTiernan turned him down, which I'm not sure how a childlike saga written by the same guy who did Die Hard would be such a good idea, but goes to show. Warner Brothers executives instead caught their eyes on Joel Schumacher, director of films such as The Lost Boys and Falling Down. and approached him with the idea of making a third Batman film. Schumacher agreed, and Batman Forever went into production. This wasn't the only example of a casting change from the first two films. A notable example being Michael Keaton, who played Batman, who dropped out of the third film out of solidarity with Tim Burton, as the two were very close friends. Because of their meddling, not only did they lose their director, who did the first two films, but also their lead actor. So, discussions began about who would be the next Batman. There were a few ideas for who was suggested to play Batman, a few of them being William Baldwin, Dean Cain, Tom Hanks of all people, Daniel Day-Lewis, Johnny Depp. There were a few caveats to those guys not being casted. Dean Cain was scrapped because he already played Superman, which obviously would be stupid for him to play Batman all of a sudden if he was already Superman. Tim Burton, who in interviews would push for Johnny Depp to play Batman, as the two were friends and had worked together for previous films such as Edward Scissorhands, which was Johnny Depp's first major role. Schumacher and Warner Brothers went a different direction and cast Val Kilmer to play Batman. According to Kilmer himself, he signed on without reading a single line of the script or knowing who the director was, reportedly because he was such a big Batman fan growing up. Another notable change occurred because of Burton leaving, which was that Two-Face was going to be recast and a secondary villain to another infamous Batman villain in the Riddler. Infamously, there were a few choices for the Riddler, some being Robin Williams and John Malkovich, but they instead ended up picking Jim Carrey, who is one of the bright spots in a pretty bad film. More on that in a second. A few offers for Two-Face came around. Eventually, the executives landed on Tommy Lee Jones, who was cast because of Schumacher's previous work with him on The Client. However, when it came time to film Batman Forever, there were a numerous amount of on-screen clashes. Schumacher and Val Kilmer clashed numerous times on set, with Schumacher reporting that Kilmer had fought with various crewmen, and that Val Kilmer refused to speak to Schumacher for 2 weeks after Schumacher told him to stop being rude. While the reasons for fighting are generally unknown, Kilmer was not the only person who had drama on set. Schumacher mentioned that Tommy Lee Jones was also a source of trouble on set, which was backed up by Jim Carrey in the 2014 interview, I believe with Howard Stern. Carrey acknowledged that Jones was not friendly to him and recounted an incident where Tommy Lee Jones found him off set at a restaurant during the production and told him, and this is a direct quote, "I hate you. I really don't like you. I cannot sanction your buffoonery." Suffice to say, after all of this drama, Batman Forever was released to a largely negative response from fans and critics. It turns out, Burton was right about how diverting the dark film noir theme was going to ruin the franchise's appeal. And the film was seen as too childlike and focused too much on humor rather than the film's story. Despite this, the film was a box office success, and a sequel was immediately put into production. In 1995, the sequel to Batman Forever, titled Batman and Robin, was set to be released in 1997, as a way to take a break from the 3-year gap between the films. Infamously, because of the numerous feuds between Kilmer and Schumacher, Kilmer opted out of the franchise to be in the infamous film The Island of Dr. Moreau, which was generally considered to be one of the worst films of all time. To put it simply, choosing The Island of Dr. Moreau over Batman Forever would be the mental equivalent of your stove being on fire, and you decide to spit on the stove instead of getting a fire hydrant, to put it lightly. Schumacher later remarked that he sort of just quit, and we sort of just fired him. So naturally, another Batman had to be drawn up. Now, infamously, Schumacher wanted William Baldwin to play Batman, similarly to Batman Forever, as previously mentioned. But Warner Brothers executives opted to pick George Clooney. The main reason being that Clooney would have fit the role of what Batman would be like in the real world. Which, honestly, that's a very smart decision. I mean, Clooney is basically Bruce Wayne in real life, if you've seen any interviews about him. The issue is that despite this decision that most Batman fans would agree would have worked had the story had been great, Schumacher made a few questionable decisions regarding the story and the look of the film. For starters, the most infamous change he made was putting nipples on Batman and Robin's suits. It has zoom-ins to emphasize this. This was a problem for Clooney because of how uncomfortable the suit was. He had to stand for hours in the suit just for the zoom-in scenes. You see, Batman's suit in Batman and Robin is generally seen as one of the worst superhero costumes of all time because of this decision, and has generally been made fun of since its release date. Another questionable decision was, like the previous film, Schumacher wrote the film to be much more childlike and focus much more on the humor than Batman Forever. The result was that Batman and Robin was critically panned and called one of the worst superhero movies ever made. Chris O'Donnell, who played Robin in Batman Forever and Batman and Robin, has since said about Batman and Robin that, quote, things felt much sharper and more focused, and it felt like everything just got a little softer on the second one. The first one, I felt like I was making a movie. The second one, I felt like I was making a toy commercial. And it really showed throughout the movie, as there were moments like Batman and Robin ice skating to prevent the villain Mr. Freeze from stealing a jewel, which naturally seems out of place for a Batman movie, even for one that's more child-centered. The issue with Batman and Robin as opposed to Batman Forever was that Batman and Robin barely surpassed its break-even point and was considered a mild flop. Warner executives would search for new ideas for a Batman film and rejected numerous ideas because of the backlash to how bad Batman and Robin was. There are actually a few notable examples I can think of. The main one being a sequel to Batman and Robin with Coolio, the rapper, of all people, being the villain. But this was shot down due to it being a sequel to Batman and Robin. There was another script that was proposed in 1998 with a 2001 release date titled Batman Dark Knight, which, by the way, was also rejected due to being a sequel to Batman and Robin. After numerous other failed attempts at a Batman script, Warner Brothers announced that relatively unknown director Christopher Nolan was going to do a Batman film titled Batman Begins. Infamously, Nolan wanted to do a dark, edgy film noir theme that Tim Burton made famous all those years ago. Warner accepted the request that it be darker, on the condition that the film not be rated R. Nolan was actually fine with it, if you could believe it. He was fine with the request, as he wanted to make a Batman film that he wanted to see as a teenager. By letting Nolan do what he wanted for the film, with little requirements, the film was a massive box office success and hailed with praise and adulation. This was in large part due to the fact that the dark film noir themes the series had, that were made famous by Burton back in 1992, as opposed to the goofy shenanigans of the previous Batman films. This singular film reinvigorated interest into the Batman films, which continued into later films by Christopher Nolan with The Dark Knight, which is generally seen as the greatest superhero film of all time, and the criminally underrated Dark Knight Rises. Many fans and critics considered Nolan's Dark Knight trilogy to be a Hail Mary attempt to keep the Batman franchise relevant, and is generally seen as the film that gave the franchise a new beginning. At the end of the day, studio interference, poor casting choices, and inconsistent tones all played a role in the collapse of the Batman franchise. And Christopher Nolan creating a darker, more edgy Batman series ultimately saved the Batman franchise. What Warner Brothers had failed to learn in Batman Forever and Batman and Robin was that Batman as a character works better in a darker setting, which is what appeals to his fanbase. Changing that idea would naturally lead to failure. However, thankfully for Batman fans, they would get what they wanted in the end and would witness the franchise begin a new era. That will be all for today. Thank you very much for listening.